chance.
Great, wonderful. I think everyone is in now. A few more folks are joining us. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar, Community Capital in the Time of COVID. I'm going to turn it over to Amara Inya. We'll do brief introductions and get into the webinar. Please throughout, feel free to put questions in the chat box. We're going to try to make time at the end just to have some engagement and certainly an opportunity to answer questions. And thank you again for joining us. Mara, take it over.
All right, so we're good to go?
Yep.
Awesome. So I want to thank all of you for being on this important discussion. And I don't want to take up too much time because we have such great speakers today who will really be driving a lot of the conversation. But I did want to take a moment to introduce this gathering and sort of some of the work that we've been doing here in Chicago, but relevant to the entire country, especially in this time of global pandemic. So my name is Amara Inya, and I am working with a group pulled together called Solidarity Chicago, and I'll let each of the individuals introduce themselves before we go in. And this group basically came together from recognizing this moment that we're in, and a lot of what has been exposed by this pandemic, especially as it relates to our economy. And the need to build the next paradigm of what an economy that actually works for people should look like, what it could look like, and make real what's possible. So I want to take a moment to give some of the other individuals from Solidarity Chicago an opportunity to introduce themselves. And I guess, Renee, I'll start with you, and then we'll just go down the line.
Great. So my name is Renee Hatcher. I am assistant director at the University of Illinois, Chicago, John Marshall Law School, where I direct the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic. Essentially what we do is provide free legal support to solidarity economy initiatives in the larger Chicagoland area. In addition to that, we work on policy issues to try to transform the local economy into one that centers solidarity economy strategies. I'm really excited for this conversation today. So many brilliant women doing so much amazing work. Thank you. I'll ask Stacy to go next.
Hi, my name is Stacy Sutton. I am a professor of urban planning and policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago, where I teach a course on the solidarity economy of graduate students. And much of both my scholarship and my organizing has been around cooperative economics and other mechanisms for collective ownership. So I was really excited to work with the other organizers, especially at this kind of moment in which we need to think about systems outside of the conventional capitalist system, ways of supporting ourselves and our communities. So that is part of the impetus for the Solidarity Chicago. And like Renee, I'm super excited to hear from our guests from out of town. I'll turn it over to Mike.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Strode, founder and coordinator of the ColaNet Collaborative. The ColaNet Collaborative is Chicago's only time-based service and skills exchange, otherwise known as a time bank. So, you know, what I do is I help communities and groups, associations in various spaces in Chicago, think about how to engage in skill sharing that is non-monetary in nature. So doing some skills mapping, doing asset-based community engagement, and really just kind of looking at the landscape of things that exist in our community beyond financial capital and ways that we can use that to meet and address some of these unmet needs. So happy to be with you all today. And am I kicking it back to Amara, or did Camille join?
So we had one more person. I think Camille is either on or will be on soon, but I'd be remiss if we didn't include her. Camille Kerr is a national consultant. She's been working with cooperatives, helping to start up cooperatives really around the country, and has just brought so much hands-on work and expertise to this group. So again, we basically came together recognizing this moment that we're in, and that there's an opportunity not just to talk about what we're trying to do in terms of staying afloat and really helping one another because of what's happened with the economy in the fallout from the pandemic, but also what it means to build the next economy. And today's topic is really important because we're dealing with those of us who've been following nationally, people and businesses who've applied for loans, people who are looking for means of survival financially and have found themselves at the short end of the stick, essentially. Many communities have not been able to access the forms of capital that have been made available, whether they've been loans or grants. And so it created an opportunity to have a really deep conversation about community capital and alternative forms of community capital that we can tap into and harness, and what that looks like both now, but also moving forward in the economy that we want for ourselves. And so we, the group pulled together an amazing panel of speakers who will be driving a lot of the conversation. And so I wanted to just quickly introduce each of the speakers that we have featured this afternoon so that you are aware of their backgrounds, and then we'll launch into the discussion from there. So first, I want to introduce Nia Evans. She is the director of the Boston Ujima Project, which is working to organize in the greater Boston area. It's organizing neighbors, business owners, and investors to create a community-controlled economy. Second, we have Dr. Jessica Gordon-Nembhard. She is a professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College. She is also the author of a book that I read and just adored called Collective Courage, A History of African American Cooperative Economic Thought and Practice. Brings a wealth of knowledge to this discussion. And finally, we have Carolyn Shanaz Hossain, Associate Professor of Business and Society in the Department of Social Science at York University in Toronto, founder of the Diverse Solidarity Economies Collective, and also author of Politicized Microfinance, Money, Power, and Violence in Black America. So again, this conversation, community capital in the time of COVID-19, is part of our series of online meetings hosted by Solidarity Chicago to elevate cooperative economics, mutual aid, and other solidarity economic tools that communities can use to support one another through this pandemic, but also beyond this pandemic. And so we are really happy to have our guest speakers here. I see Camille has jumped on the line. Thank you so much for being able to join us in the discussion. And I think with that, we'll dive right in. First and foremost for our speakers, if you can just talk a little bit about your work, but the first question is really, what does community capital, what do we mean when we say community capital? What do we mean when we say community harnessing capital that already exists in the community? If we can sort of start with that baseline framework, I think that'll give some context to the rest of the discussion.
Can I start?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, so when I'm thinking of community capital and the way that I use it, it's really about prioritizing people first, then, you know, people, workers, what have you, but humans. Then I think about product. We should think about product really in that order, and before capital. And I think that when you think about a lot of the cooperative economics that we do, or things that are really indigenous to who we are as a people, capital doesn't need to take precedence over the way that we live our lives. And I'm teaching this to my students when we look at case studies like the Mondragon. And part of what they were doing in the 50s through a very liberatory framework for cooperativism was really trying to prioritize the need for workers and human beings, right? Before sort of how we focus in a traditional concept of what capital is, it tends to take the precedence over everything else, and then we kind of order our lives accordingly. And part of what I'm reaching to is this idea of, and I was trained under this economist, and I wish we'd use more of his work because I think it has so much meaning. I know it has meaning in community economic development in parts of Canada. And it's by the name of the economist, his name is C.Y. Thomas. And many of you may have known him. He wrote this wonderful book called The Poor and the Powerless. But he has this concept of this convergence theory, this idea of self-sufficiency. You know, why don't we produce, you know, what we need? And he was writing in a context of really pushing against this idea of capital being very internationalized, because he's writing in the small state of Guyana. But it has resonance for minorities, excluded groups of people, like Indigenous people in Canada. And it underlines, you know, a set of cooperative and community economic development principles that are currently being used in Winnipeg, right? And they have this thing called the Nietzsche Cooperative or Community Economic Principles. And it really does come out of C.Y. Thomas's larger ideas of convergence, right? And how do we stop becoming so economically dependent on this foreign capital, you know, import-export kind of thing, and try to really work from within. But I mean, I'm gonna leave it at that. I think that it may come in again, but you kind of get the idea of where I'm going with community capital.
Awesome.
I can jump in because Nia, I think, probably is going to say even more about it. But I'll continue with the way Carolyn was talking out. And first, I just want to thank the organizers. You guys are an incredible group of people, so thank you so much. And I always start with recognizing original stewards of the land, acknowledging our ancestors, and also those who labor without just compensation. So let's bring all that into the room. For me, in addition to the things that Caroline said, community capital is pooling family, neighborhood, and local organizing resources, especially finance capital, but not just money. It's also skills, shared activities, shared activism, right? And the purpose, as we said, is community well-being, community betterment. So using surplus, using resources to create surplus, leveraging pooled resources to better allocate what we've got, to make sure we do real grassroots development and real values-based, right? We use capital in a values-based way to make the world better, to make our lives better, to make our communities better. I think it also includes teaching and learning and teaching, right? Learning and teaching how to use capital in this way, as well as supporting sort of democratic community and worker control over community assets. And by community assets, I also mean cooperatives, community-owned businesses, credit unions, community-based institutions like even schools, libraries, social services, right? All those things under community capital should be under the community control and purposed for the betterment of the community, for the betterment of the rest of us.
Awesome.
And,
Nia,
sure, I'll pick up from there. Thank you, Jessica, and thank you, Carolyn. And likewise, with thanking all of the organizers for bringing us together. We have the honor of having Jessica do one of our lectures in Boston. I think it was, I don't know if it was last year or the year before. So it's great to be in conversation with Jessica again. Do you remember when it was, Jessica?
I'm trying to remember. It might have been like November 18.
I think it was.
Right?
Yep. Yeah.
Anyway, it was a wonderful program. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Time flies, and right now time is standing still. But I think what I would add to that is I would like to expand on, and I'm sure Mike is probably thinking about this, but just thinking expansively about what capital is. And so when we think about community capital, really thinking expansively about what we have currently in our communities of value. I would add to that, I'm thinking of a couple of things. There's a process piece that I'm thinking of. When I say value, there's a value piece that I'm thinking of, and there's a power piece that I'm thinking of, because I'm also thinking of just on the power front and along the lines of community control, who's doing what. And so in community capital, we are the doers. We are the decision makers. We are determining value. And when Jessica talks about values-based, thinking about value both in that sense, and then also kind of in the sense that we've traditionally come to think of value. So when we have conversations about wealth and net worth, et cetera, I would say a part of community capital is us taking the reins of power to determine, even along those traditional lines, how we value what we have right now. And then in the process piece, again, just along the values alignment, to what ends we're using our capital. And I pointed out Mike because Ujima has a time bank. So again, that's where I'm thinking just very expansively about what we label as capital. And then the community piece being understanding that it is we who are determining to what ends it is used, and it is we who are determining what our needs are.
Great.
Thank you.
Could you say more perhaps about the role that community capital has played in larger cooperative development strategies in the US and what that has meant for solidarity economy in Black communities, but cooperative development and the role that community capital has played in some of that historically and today?
Yes, sure. Most of you know that's my passion. I've spent years trying to study what we have done and what we can continue to do. So since we're talking about capital, let's start with the fact that African Americans were brought to the Western Hemisphere, particularly talking about the US, right? We were brought to this soil enslaved as chattel. So we didn't even own our own bodies, let alone have capital or have any kind of what people would normally think of as wealth. So it's been an issue, right, from the beginning of our forced migration, right? It's been part of the mission of our struggles for liberation and prosperity to have some kind of control over our bodies, our land, our capital, our wealth, right? But for over 400 years in this hemisphere, we've also experienced asset stripping, right? Asset stripping of any of our wealth, any of our property, stripping of our humanity, and also resilience to that. So what has the resilience and the resistance to that asset stripping been like? Well, it's been that we've pooled any kind of resource that we've had. We've practiced serious mutual aid and economic cooperation. We've established collectives and cooperatives. We've needed to do that to survive, but we've also needed to do it to resist more enslavement and all kinds of oppression. And the purpose for doing this pooling of resources and collectivizing whatever we have has been to provide community care, right? From the gamut, right? Just making sure we all can eat and are healthy to making sure we can be buried. So I want to talk about first the mutual aid societies, right? Because they still exist, they can still exist, and they have existed from the beginning for a variety of issues. I've got a couple of examples of how mutual aid has contributed and created community capital. One of my examples is the Free African Society in Philadelphia, started out in the late 1700s. By 1816, they actually established the first independent Black church, the AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church, right? So think about that example, right? They pooled resources, first for burial and funerals, then for orphanages and feeding ourselves, etc. But eventually that pooled capital, that community capital, was put into also establishing a physical and a spiritual place, a church that would be in control, right? So the capital, community capital, allowed us to have that independent church. So to create independent institutions, not just to do the day-to-day feeding us or whatever. One of the largest Black mutual banks, and then it was also owned a department store in Richmond, Virginia, early 20th century, was from the Society of the Independent Order of St. Luke, another mutual aid association, revamped in the late 1800s and into the 20th century by the Black women who took over their board, and a particular Black woman who became their president. She's the one who said, we need a bank, we need a community bank, we need a bank that's purpose is to put money into the communities, give loans, make sure the community can develop the way we want to, and develop affordable housing. So another really important strategy of taking our pooled resources and then doing more with it to do more for the community. During the Great Depression in Chicago, right, the residents of the Rosenwald apartments actually established the People's Consumer Cooperative. It started out as a boycott of local white chain stores that were discriminating against Blacks. They created a study group, started a buying club, and eventually opened up a retail store by July of 1937. By September, they also opened up a credit union. So again, this combination, immediate needs, food, right? Then credit union, you need credit, access to capital, finance, that all needs to be controlled by us within our group, right? They then added a meat market. They doubled the size of their store by 1938 and even distributed dividends. So then we have another aspect of this community ownership, community capital. Not just do we pool resources to put things in so that we have better control, we can create the institutions we want, but also we can get dividends back to ourselves, to our families, back to the community, so that it's a circular model. It's not an extraction model. The last thing I want to say for this part, I know we're on a time scheme, but I also want to just talk quickly about the Black Panther Party. Also had their community development survival practices while we're waiting for the revolution, right? And again, in that model, it's a solidarity economics, collectives, cooperatives. They used collectives and cooperatives to fund and to enable all kinds of community activities, including the free health clinics, the free breakfast programs, and the free education programs. They had free transportation for the elderly, transportation to prisons, a pest control program. All of these were community assets, community controlled and community run. And the last thing I just wanted to say is that in terms of the movement for community capital, the solidarity economy movement, Black people have often and usually have been in the forefront of mutual aid, community development movements. Community controlled economic development movement, community development corporations, community development finance movement are all credited having started and modeled on what Black community, Black demands have been for practices of community control. Black women were the initiators in Washington, D.C. of the housing co-op movement. D.C. has the second largest number of housing co-ops. And if you look at that history, it was started by Black women who were demanding that kind of asset. And you can go on and see the role that Blacks have played, not just in our own community, but in the community at large, to bring this to a broad, to make this policy at local and state and federal levels.
Great, thank you.
That was awesome. I think a number of things that you've said, and for those who are tuning in a little bit later, we will have a recording of this also available on YouTube so that you can catch the full context of the conversation. But there's so much information that was encapsulated in your statement regarding the different forms of cooperative organizing. I know there's also a movement around public banking, to establish public banks throughout the country. That's something that I know I've been involved in. What's important for those who are tuning in is to know that this isn't a new concept that we just came up with in this moment because of a pandemic. And those who've been organizing around the solidarity economy for years know that, this work has been ongoing, pushing this into, or attempting to push this into the economic mainstream as almost as a going back to practices that particularly the Black community has always utilized to survive in times of duress, which is pretty much all the time. So with that, I think a lot of people may be wondering, what are those initial steps? How do you, for even getting the trust factor? I know that's something that I talk about a lot with people who have questions about, well, how do we trust who's in the circle? Who do we pool our money with? I only have a limited amount of money. Who do I, pool with? Can you talk a little bit about some of those initial conversations or some initial perceived obstacles to organizing communities into solidarity economies? And what are some of the things that you advise individuals as they are embarking on that journey?
So great question. The very first thing that struck me as I started to do this research is how important collective study is and was for most of the examples. People come together to talk about the problems, but they quickly realized they needed to talk about solutions, not just talk about problems, and to learn all they could about a variety of options so they could create their own solutions that were meaningful, etc. And so the study groups, almost all the Black co-ops I learned about started with some kind of study group, some kind of coming together. Studying together also, the more I actually have been studying this, studying together also is a way to start to build trust and relationships that you're going to need for running a business cooperatively or sharing money cooperatively. So it turns out, I think that what we might call bonding now happens when you do study groups. So there's also some level of bonding. I know there's some groups right now who also do a serious bonding exercises and trust building exercises. There's a group in Atlanta that actually put together a manual on trust building through African principles and African spirituality. And nobody can join their co-op unless they've gone through at least one weekend of this, working through this workbook on Black trust building, African trust building, and spirituality. So they're very specific that if we don't understand how to do that, how to trust each other and work together and do it from an indigenous spiritual sense of ourselves, we're not going to be able to run our co-op. And in their case, it's a co-op to help everyone get down payments to own their own home. And so they're talking about people putting in, hundreds of thousands of dollars to pool resources in order to buy homes. So they know they have to be serious about making sure people trust each other to share that money. And I know Carolyn's going to talk to you also more about the Roscas and other ways that people build trust. The last thing I would say is the communications, right? A lot of people, especially in the mutual aid sense, put their 10 cents or their dollar in because they really, for survival, right? They really need the thing that the mutual aid society is doing, right? And so they put the money in first without necessarily thinking about long-term. And so I think that's the other lesson for us today in terms of thinking about mutual aid. We need to both think about the immediate need, and that can be a driving force for why we would invest, but we also need to think about the long-term. We want to invest also because of all the things values-based capital can do for us in our communities. And we need to think about, what does that mean? How do we need to make sure to train ourselves so that we can be in it for the long term? We don't just do it for the 6 months that we think we need it or whatever, but we're in it for a longer term. And so again, trying to be understanding of that, trying to train ourselves in conflict transformation, things like that, I think matter. So there is a lot of training and a lot of trust building we have to be deliberate about. And I know some groups actually do make sure to take like months to do all this kind of training, from talking about who you would even share money with to that kind of thing before they actually start a project. So having that patience to be really prepared.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think that's a really good transition. So Caroline, you've done all this wonderful research on Roscas, which I'm not sure how many people actually know what that means, but on cooperative practices of both on the African continent and in the diaspora, of women and groups of people more or less using community capital in different ways. So could you talk to us about what some of that looks like, and like what are some of the lessons learned from informal practices of the Roscas, and how we might think about that in the context of some of the other historical aspects of community capital?
Okay, thanks everyone. My segment here is going to be great because it feeds off of what Nia and Jessica's talking about, this idea of values-based capital, right? And if we have a real life experience of that, we can say that it's through these things called Roscas, right? That stands for, folks who's new to this concept, rotating savings and credit associations. There's different ASCAs, SACOs. There are a lot of more local and cultural names I'll get to in a minute, but I'm going to use the term ROSCA and sort of give you a little bit of an intro of what that is, because that's what I'm steeped in right now heavily. I've moved away from more formalized microfinance, as Renee knows, and I'm moving into this thing that's much more indigenous. It's driven by people. It is distinct from formalized cooperatives. They are not a primitive cooperative. They are cooperating in their own right. And I wouldn't have been able to do a lot of this work if I couldn't build off of the work of collective courage and the work that Jessica has done historically, kind of outing the ways that the African diaspora have always been engaged in some form of collectivity. So I sit in Toronto, Canada. I'm of Caribbean origin. So when I'm speaking to you now, I will be speaking to you more about a global African diaspora. It will include those who are in a number of the Caribbean islands where they are situated, but as well as those who relocate to, more global parts of our world, be it New York, Miami, Toronto, London, what have you. So I just wanted to situate what I'll talk about when I speak to ROSCAs, because they're very much alive. I do a lot of empirical field work, meaning that I've spoken, I don't know, it's almost embarrassing to say this, but I've been working on ROSCAs since 2008, and I still haven't gotten the book out. So I feel a bit like pathetic in so many ways, but you should know that doing work, empirical work on ROSCAs is not easy. And part of it is, and particularly in the Western part of our world, just doing research, imagine just doing the research on this. And part of it is because people are working below the radar for many reasons. And people would be like, why do they work below the radar in Canada? Maybe they're making this up, that they even exist, and why would they exist in a major capital city like Toronto or Montreal? And so I'm here to say that there are, and I'm only speaking to hundreds, there are literally thousands of them existing, and beyond just people of the African diaspora, right? So that's some truth telling, right? We have South Asians, we have Chinese people, Latins, all kinds of wonderful cultures, people of color that are engaging in ROSCAs. I mean, literally, I collect a list of the different names that ROSCAs are called by. We in the academy refer to them as ROSCAs, right? But they go by all kinds of names: Susu, Ojo, Boxhand, Patna, Arizan, Kai. I mean, as far as Japan, Korea, Indonesia, India, all over Africa, right? I'm more familiar with things like Ekub and Susu in Ghana, but as well as the Caribbean. And actually, I have a film coming out trying to plot and really speak to this concept of ROSCAs and really about changing mindset. And so ROSCAs are, as Jessica mentioned, these voluntary, somewhat mutual aid institutions that people choose who they're going to come together with. Often they're kin, but sometimes they're friends. They could be from the exact same cultural network, and they choose to pool money, usually money, capital that we're talking about, together, okay? And this is a very ancient history. I remember doing my sabbatical in Ethiopia last year, and Ethiopians were like, that's great that you're here, because we're the originators of what cooperatives are all about. So it's great that you've come here, because we're the land of origins, right? And we know what cooperation is. We wouldn't have been able to persevere in humanity without these kinds of systems. And a lot of what they talk about when they talk about cooperatives is this system called Ekub or Edir or Wenfel. And these are all various forms of cooperatives. They don't have to be necessarily financial. They can be, sort of productive or, you know, consumer, or parts of the care that Jessica was talking about, schools and what have you. So that we know that when we talk about Africa and its diaspora, Roscas are very much embedded there, but also globally. And there's been lots of work really treating and thinking about it. But one of the best pieces that I've read very recently, it's an older piece though, it's by an economist who Jess knows very well, Nagina Chaichi. She wrote a piece about, you know, the social collateral of Roscas, and that's why they matter, right? It's the community information. Like, they're the best bankers in the world. These women will tell you, I know nothing about banking, I'm not even schooled, but somehow they have the best compliance. They know how to track people who are being completely excluded. And not only are they offering financial access, but they're also doing this other stuff we need as human beings, right? We need other things to feed us, right? Moral support, care, you know, just friendship, advice, all kinds of stuff. So Somalis will throw a fish party, right? Like a fish samosa party, but that's really just, you know, a gimmick, I think, in so many ways, to say, come on, let's share food, but let's talk politics. Let's talk about the inequities that exist in our society and how do we cope every day, you know? And as a Canadian academic, I studied in this place called the Maritimes and lived there for like 3 or 4 years. And there is a real important story that we as Canadians have, which is the anti-Ganesh movement. And I'm always amazed many people don't know this story. And it speaks to this kind of, you know, abuse that commercial firms were doing to fisher folks who just wanted to make a good life. And these Catholic priests took on this liberatory kind of movement around these kitchen tables, they called it. It was adult pedagogy. It was really about them thinking through things. They had some literacy in there. They had friendship and bonds forming to really like push against this crazy extremist version of capitalism, right? And now in Toronto, you know, for the past, whatever, 8 years, I sit around these kitchen tables, quote unquote, with women of color, Black women, who are doing precisely these kinds of Rosca systems throughout our major cities, because there's such a systemic issue with banking exclusion of all kinds, right? The humiliation and even self-exclusion, like why set yourself up to go into a bank if they're just going to humiliate you, and they have these ridiculous rigid rules when you know the banker lady down the street understands what you need. There is a level of trust. There is all kinds of reciprocity built into these networks, and it's something that you know and do. So if I could just, I'll just wrap it up in that, you know, these systems of Roscas are peppered throughout our cities in the West, but we should be giving some sort of credit due to people and African diaspora people elsewhere as they move into places like Toronto, Montreal, Canada. We have all this knowledge, right? Like Jess is like, I think what underscores collective courage and why we as women scholars are so connected to it is because it acknowledges that there is expertise, right, in collectivity. It's not something that someone taught us how to do. We actually have power over this. We know how to be collective, right? And so part of this COVID crisis, which I think is really annoying to me, is that we have a lot of people who are talking about this rebirth. They're finding mutual aid and, you know, what Roscas are about. And that's a bunch of baloney, because these things are what sustain many communities of color, particularly those that are excluded, as a form of one of the diverse forms of, you know, financial services, their menu that they have, right? And many of us who grew up in such families, you knew that that was just one of the financial devices you had to play with, right? It sends us to school, it pays mortgages, it buys inventory for a small business, and you're doing all of this with people that you know and trust, right? Anyways, I'm gonna stop there so you kind of know, this is like a work in progress. I just don't want to say that it's 2 decades and I still haven't gotten the book out. But anyways, I'm still working on it. And part of it is because depending on your context of where you are examining African diaspora, Roscas aren't an easy thing to access because there's a lot of stigmatization, a lot of hostility, even in places of like progressive cities like Toronto or Montreal, where Black folk are hiding these forms of civic engagement. There's literally no support from formalized cooperative institutions that profess a lot of inclusion of these systems. So people of color, at least diasporic and immigrant people, are left out to their own devices, and they turn to these kinds of systems. And it's kind of interesting for me as a researcher, because I'm also looking at in the Caribbean, and Black folk are, so happy to instruct us. And it's so much a part of their society, and the banker ladies are well respected and they don't have to hide this. So it's really interesting to do that comparatively of what will it take in a Western context to give support to forms of mutual aid where many people of color actually have to seek refuge, and that's why they're informal, if you know what I mean. Anyways, I mean, we can talk about that in discussion, but I hope I can leave it there. Okay.
Great, thank you. And so I think you highlighted a number of things that are really important and kind of ties into some of the work that Nia is doing, right? One, we wanted to make sure that it was very clear that none of this is new, that none of this is happening in just one particular place. Certainly, like that this is a part of cultural practices, that a lot of this work has been done in the Black community. And so, but also, as more and more folks, as mutual aid gets more visibility in the time of COVID, like what does it mean to start and use these strategies in different ways? And so Nia, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how these community development loan funds are different, like what Ujima's work looks like and how that actually works in a time of COVID.
Sure, thank you very much. And Carolyn, that was rich, thank you. So I'm definitely gonna be pulling some things from what you've said in my responses, and some things from what you've said as well, Jessica. So in terms of what's different about, or what I would say is what's different about a community loan fund specifically is, I think the thing that I'd like to kind of pull out, both from what Carolyn and Jessica said, is the difference between informality and formality. And so for me, that would be one of the primary differences, for example, about the Ujima Fund in and of itself. That the Ujima Fund is a formal structure that's housed in a formal structure. And then I would say it's then surrounded by some processes that have been formalized in one way or another, but there are also still some of those informal processes that I think both Carolyn and Jessica have referenced. And as Carolyn said, because we know collectivity, so there's just a way, I think, in just being that we're going to see some of these historical ways of being just kind of showing up again and again and again. So that's one of the primary differences for me, I would say, is the level of formality. And the other would be that the loan fund, again, in and of itself, if I'm just thinking about the fund, not Ujima, the organization, or Ujima, the ecosystem, it's of a piece of mutual aid. And I believe I've kind of already talked a little bit about how, in my mind, that's situated. So it's definitely a tool that is of a piece of a wider or larger way of being. I think the other piece that Jessica said, or there was something else that Jessica said that for me, I say would be a bit of a difference as well. And so Jessica talked about the difference between attending to immediate needs versus thinking about the long term. And so, so Jessica was talking about this within the context of mutual aid as a whole. So within the context of mutual aid as a whole, there's the opportunity to attend to both immediate needs and long term. I would say one difference though is definitely our loan fund is not seen as a short term entity. So it is intended to serve more of the long term needs of a community. And so when we're thinking about resourcing small businesses, for example, we're thinking about resourcing them towards growth and sustenance. When we're thinking about resourcing real estate, again, we're thinking about infrastructure. We're thinking about what's long term. Similarly, we've talked about resourcing community infrastructure, and then infrastructure. I think that's probably kind of the last piece that I would want to hone in on, which for me kind of ties to formality and informality. What's been interesting to me about this pandemic, and I appreciate your remarks, Carolyn, about whether or not this is the rebirth or something anew, and your remarks, Renee, about just this is increasing visibility of mutual aid. I have been wondering about what it would look like, I guess, to have more of a formal mutual aid infrastructure in this country. And I don't know what your thoughts would be about that, Carolyn and Jessica. But definitely seeing how many of us have identified mutual aid as the process that is most effectively resourcing us right now it's remarkable. So there's a reason that we're all turning to it right now, and there's a reason that the visibility has increased because this is in the failure of what would be considered legitimate institutions. So I would definitely just be interested in your remarks, Carolyn and Jessica. So those are for me, those are the primary differences that I would know. And I don't know if you would want me to kind of go into Ujima's work a little more, but I want to just kind of stop and see which direction you would want to go first.
Yeah, I think that's great for Caroline and Jessica to respond to that point. If you could just say, Nia, you mentioned you were separating out Ujima's fund and like all the other things that Ujima does, right? I think one theme throughout everyone's comments is this idea that community capital is also about kind of incorporating a certain politic or more or less like collective well-being, sometimes just a Black liberation framework explicitly. If you could say like what the other stuff that goes hand in hand with the Ujima fund is and kind of what that lens is, what that perspective is.
Okay, absolutely, thank you. And yeah, and I think this we also saw this reflected in Carolyn's remarks as well. So Ujima takes an ecosystem approach. And what that means is what we've done is we actually, the origin of Ujima is studying what it would take to start a public bank. And so Amara, you talked about that at the top of the conversation. So in 2014, Aaron Tanaka, who I know a few of you know, and I kind of scrolled through some of the audience. So I know that there are some people in the audience that know Aaron, whose org is our fiscal sponsor, Center for Economic Democracy. And this is important to remember, and I always try to mention this, and I just try to be careful with time, which is why I haven't in this conversation. But I always try to mention all of the people who were involved in creating Ujima, because it was a lot of people. And I always kind of envision if we were to really kind of properly credit everyone, it would be kind of like movie credits, because you watch the end of the movie and you see the 200 people that worked on the film. So I would say it's likewise with Ujima. So his organization, Center for Economic Democracy, City Life Vida Urbana, which is Boston's premier housing justice organization. And again, this is so important to remember, just when we think about all of the different types of people and groups that came together for this. And Boston Impact Initiative, which is a local impact investing firm that was kind of pioneering for putting a lens on racial equity within the impact investing world. In 2014, started a study group to say, what would it look like to start a public bank? And that was to address the issues that Jessica talked about. So this was looking at how grassroots orgs struggle to sustain ourselves. We're largely funded by philanthropic foundations, which means we've got to pay a lot of attention to what it is they want. And then also just our small businesses in our community struggle as well. And this was over a year. And so here I think we see the study group process that Jessica talked about, and the relationship building, the trust building, and what I should say is, and these relationships were built and the trust was built prior to the study group, year-long study group, and it magnified or intensified over that time. Over that year, the group studied financial institutions, they studied alternative currency, they studied participatory budgeting, they studied time banking. And the lens was, what are the models that we know that are out there that are centering our communities the way we think our communities should be centered, that have shown to be effective. And at the end of the year, what the group came to was the decision that they actually couldn't pick one, not even a public bank. So a public bank was hard, it still is. But they said, even if it were not hard to start a public bank, even these other models, we can't pick just one. We're talking systemic issues, we should be thinking systemic response. And so that leads us to Ujima's ecosystem. And so our ecosystem is comprised of the loan fund. We have a business alliance that's set up to provide peer support, a technical assistance network that's set up to provide technical assistance to the businesses that we invest in. We combine that with an anchor institution strategy, and that's where we talk with our large anchor institutions, hospitals, schools, and we've included large faith institutions in that for Ujima's purposes, to talk about doing business with our businesses, take out contracts with our businesses, think about what type of citizens they're being in our communities, being that they have such large footprints. We have our membership body that we call our General Assembly, and this was patterned after Cooperation Jackson's assembly process. And we before used to have a really gnarly ecosystem chart that we've stopped showing because it would amaze people and overwhelm people at the same time. But in the center of that chart was our membership body. And then we have a consumer organizing strategy. And what that means is we have our membership body, which are community members. And what we said is we engage in creative organizing. It's just our organizing way of saying marketing. So that's us going out of our way to shop at the businesses that we invest in. It's being community ambassadors, really thinking about how we uplift the profile of our investments. And then we have our policy wing, we have our grassroots network that we look to for guidance just on the policy front. So for example, City Life Vida Urbana, who I mentioned, we're supporting their rent control campaign. Divest Invest campaign, where we're trying to engage with the city and with anchor institutions by divesting from fossil fuels and prisons and then investing in our fund. So that's our ecosystem. And so then just in what I've tried to really quickly describe, I would say definitely, for example, we have a time bank. So when I think about our time bank, when I think about our membership body, that's where I think about some of the more natural, informal processes that I've talked about where we see the mutual aid sensibilities arise, and we do our best to nurture that and to not get in the way of it. And then we have the fund, as I've said, which is situated in that ecosystem. And we have some pieces of the ecosystem that are designed to directly surround our investments and support our investments, but not everything is about the fund, which is essentially what I was trying to point out earlier, that it is about our relationships. And I think I was hearing this strain of what Carolyn said. It is about how we are interacting with each other. It is about how we're engaging with transactions with each other. And so we're very attentive to that as well.
Before Renee gets to the next question, I wanted to just underscore some of what Nia said as far as this has to be an ecosystem. What we're discussing here when we talk about the solidarity economy is not a niche, and it's not just a piece that people happen to be doing, although it does happen in pockets and in communities, but it requires many different parts to create the kind of economy as a whole that we want. And so when we're talking about solidarity economies, we're talking about worker-owned cooperatives. We're also talking about community land trusts. We're talking about the financial institutions that can actually support that. So if that's public banking, or if it's our community development financial institutions, our CDFIs, all of these are necessary parts of a suite of proposals that we have to, at least those of us working in the space, we have to continue to push as we are mainstreaming, especially because of the increased visibility now of mutual aid and of these as places that people are turning to because of what's happened with the pandemic. So I think it's important for us to know that what we're doing doesn't take place in a vacuum, that even as if we focus on a particular component of this, it really is an ecosystem. It really is a systemic approach that addresses all of the things that would allow for a different kind of economy, but also making sure that we're still holding our institutions accountable for what they're supposed to do. Because we also, even as we utilize mutual aid, it doesn't let our institutions off the hook for doing what they're supposed to do on our behalf as well. So I just wanted to reiterate that point and really support what Nia was saying.
Yeah, that's great. And so as I know we want to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I'd like for both Jessica and Caroline to kind of double back to this question that I think Nia posed around, as folks are really getting a lot of what they need, a lot of folks in communities are really receiving what they need through mutual aid, through folks actually just coming together and figuring out ways to pull resources in this moment outside of the government, as we know, or outside of more formal institutions. What would it look like for mutual aid to be the primary way that we kind of get the things that we need? But I want to, obviously connect it to the pandemic, but beyond, because I think one of the goals of the solidarity economy, again, is to create these institutions that are controlled by collectives of people that can actually respond to what we need and that we control directly. So, more or less we can create the institutions that we need, that we can receive, the resources that we need. So just doubling back on Nia's question and how that relates to navigating and getting through the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. So Jessica or Caroline, you want to tackle that?
Yes, go.
Jessica, I think Caroline.
Sorry, I thought Caroline was ready to answer. I can go after Caroline.
She volunteered you, Jessica.
She volunteered you.
Okay, sorry. I'm trying to share the stage here. So how do I want to say it? I guess for me, I don't have a great answer. That's why I was hoping Caroline would go first. But anyway, I think for me, it's a combination. I think we're all saying this about combinations, right? I think it's important for us to take charge of and to control as much of the resources in our communities as we can, because that's the way to really make sure they're going to be, that does the power and the values piece, right? That those of us who are living it, who are there, know what we need and should be in control of what we need, right? I agree also that that doesn't mean we leave the rest, you know, government and other people off the hook, but I don't think we can, maybe it's not even think. For me, the strategy is the power comes from us taking charge of as much as we can and then demanding the rest, right? There's some interesting examples of that in history, which maybe I don't need to get into, but in North Carolina in the 30s, they decided they needed a full-time nurse in their community. They raised half the money through the co-op, and then they demanded from the state that they needed a full-time nurse, that they could only pay for a half-time nurse, and lo and behold, the state gave them the money for the other half of the nurse. So that's what I'm sort of talking about. You do for yourself, but then you demand from our systems, from the state, from other corporations, et cetera, the rest of what we need. So in some ways we can leverage that. The other reason why I think we have to start from our own power and from our own control is because then we know better what else we need, right? We know for sure that all the top-down things, other people saying, oh, you need this, or oh, we're going to give you this, or whatever, doesn't really work very well. So what if we do it from the bottom up, right? We do everything we can to take care of ourselves as the best we can under our own principles and values, right? And then we say to the next level up and the other levels, but we also need this from you because you've been extracting this from us, or because you haven't done this, or you didn't do this the right way. And so I think also being able to do policy advocacy from a perspective of we've already practiced, we've already started to do this, we know what we need and want, and demand the rest, I think, right? So starting with ourselves also allows us to do that. And so I think both those things, that bottom up, knowing what other policies and programs and resources we need after we've tried to do them ourselves, and also being the ones in control of it. And so if we already have control, then whatever we demand or whatever does come down, we can control that too. So I guess those would be the two things I would focus on the most. I know it sounds a little optimistic, but I don't honestly know how else to do this work. I don't really know how else we can really do liberation without that power, without making sure the power is in our hands to do it, and listening to each other, right? And learning how to listen to each other and work together, and then move up from that. And for the pandemic, I would actually say the same thing. Now is a great time for us to study together, right? At least we can do that, even if it's only by phone for people who don't really have internet, right? We can study together, we can plan, we can think about the stuff that we can control and that we can do for ourselves, and then start thinking about what are the demands we have to make of society and of the corporations and of government, because we can't do it, or at least they're not allowing us to do it for ourselves. So I hope that sort of answers the questions on the table.
So, I was thinking about this question, and this idea, this pandemic, COVID, has been so brutal, right, to people of color, primarily Black. We're still trying to figure out data in the Canadian context, and believe it or not, we look to the US because at least you're disaggregating your data. In Toronto, they're sensible enough to understand that that makes sense, but still when they think about disaggregating at the provincial level, they're okay with doing it as long as it's intersectional and meaning gender and age, right? So that's the era that's the context that I'm living in, that intersectionality now has been reduced to age and gender, probably not as offensive as really acknowledging the racial inequities that exist in our society, right? And so, I mean, imagine we are looking to the US for some pointers on how to disaggregate, right? So that we can make better decisions in how we help people who are falling through the cracks. And this reminds me, and I'm always plugging my Canadians, but this guy by the name of John Rapley, he's at Cambridge. Most days he hangs his hat somewhere in Johannesburg. He's a writer. I met him when I was at UWI in Jamaica. And he wrote this piece recently, and I'm happy I'll give it to the wonderful organizers to share it. But he wrote this piece about how COVID has been quite just in its wrath and has no patience for states who are either in denial of what is going on, refuse to help its citizens, or have some sort of arrogance. And it has been really brutal in certain places, right? With just reason. And it's a kind of a problematic piece that he wrote, but what he's getting at, and he's the guy that wrote this book called Understanding Development, which is a pretty good piece of work. And what he's trying to get at is COVID has been really harmful to people of color. And a lot of it has to do because of these political elites and business elites who have really messed up. And these inequities are what's happening as a result are coming out of the fore, right? So they're so glaring, and they're glaring and embarrassing to even white people, right? Like, and white people who don't want to be in a society like that either. So where I sit in Canada, African Canadians are, you know, who report in are maybe 3 to 5% of the population. That's not enough for us to have a constituency to do the kinds of things that maybe African Americans want to do, or African diaspora in the Caribbean would like to do. But in the Canadian context, we need to figure out those alliances, right? And we need to figure out who are the people, white folk, other communities of color, that we can really work with to address and figure out how do we build new economies. But I think Jess is spot on in this way of thinking about ownership, right? And if we don't own our own, you know, things that we want to do, like our own economics, and figure out what that liberation looks like, then someone else will do that work for us. And that really is not going to be good in terms of what we're thinking about rebuilding, or what do they say? Build back better, right? Or, you know, whatever. That build back better, I think we need to be in charge of that. One thing that I think COVID is also exposing is that Black folk, and we have to accept some of this, is that we're really good. And I think I had this talk with Stacy and maybe Renee, I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but this idea that we're really good at politics, right? We're really good at thinking about how to respond in terms of our rights and what have you. But where we don't own it is when we think about money and business, right? And economics. And I don't know why, but I think economics has really done a good job at making it seem like it's this special, you need this specialized expertise to have an opinion about what economy looks more human. And experts like, you know, at Cambridge will tell you that's a lot of crap. And we need to start figuring out, just as we can get into complicated issues like justice, what the law looks like, what health looks like, well, we need to start thinking about what our economy looks like. And these inequities, if anything, are showing us that we need to be thinking about more democratic economic institutions that have more accountability. And that means if we have cooperatives and credit unions in our neighborhoods, which are existing, that are not looking like a reflection of its community, and I'm calling out, in my cultural context, we have a legacy of cooperatives and credit unions, but they're not reflective of the diversity that exists. And I think if we have those institutions, we need to make them figure out how they make us included, and not just as consumers or as members, but also to rethink how they restructure themselves, because I don't want to have to rethink about how do we create and design our own new entire economy, but how, if we have cooperatives and credit unions on the ground, how do we either infiltrate them, how do we make them take notice of the things that we need so that they are reflective of our histories? Because I'm from here and I'm not going away, and there's a lot of Canadians of color that are here, Black Canadians, and we should be a part of those institutions as well, and not relegated as groups who don't understand cooperativism. So I think that's what COVID is trying to bring some, I don't know, some truth in some ways, right? Like seize this moment, right? To create something that could be lasting, and look at the institutions that may make more sense. And I'm saying this because I just had someone write to me. I don't even know who this person is, but he's a Nigerian in Toronto, and he does some sort of you know, Rosca slash community fund, and the commercial banks have shut down all his financial services because they thought he was doing illicit activities. And I'm like, why are you working with that commercial banker? You know, that is some bullcrap. Like, we need to rethinking, we need to take accountability and put our money where we are respected, right? And so some of that work has to be, and I like what Ujima is doing. I want to be a part of Ujima movement. I mean, I think it's fantastic. I mean, that's the kind of stuff we need to be seeing. How do we ally with groups who really want us, you know, to contribute and to build a new society together? Anyways, I'll stop. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. A couple of things as we now shift to taking some of the questions from the chat, but I did want to underscore what Caroline was saying regarding taking control of our economies, and really to assert that, yes, there is a, I think, intentional mystification of the economy and economic principles and finance and banking that I found to simply be a mechanism to disempower people and a mechanism to stratify access to information and to lead people to believe that they have to go and get an expensive MBA to understand banking and finance. We have always understood commerce. Whether it's a market in Nigeria or in South America or in the Caribbean, or our susus and tandas and all of the ways that we engage with each other. We've always understood that. And so part of the challenge, I think, is we're educating the public, and as this is gaining more visibility, is to demystify economic principles, demystify public finance, demystify financial conversations generally, because it's in that people can feel comfortable to now take charge of determining what your economic landscape looks like, determining how you use money, determining how we work collectively, as opposed to relying on the very institutions that bank on, pun intended, are being mystified or fearful of engaging in these conversations. That's how they get over on our communities, which is why this conversation around community control of our capital and building the institutions that serve our interests is absolutely essential in this time. So I really thank you, Caroline, for bringing up that point. It's something that I think in future conversations we'll definitely need to reiterate. I wanted to take a few of the questions that have come in for the chat. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Some of the ones that have come in, we've kind of answered throughout the course of this conversation, but I want to make sure folks get a few, some hard tangibles to take away. So one of the questions that's come in, it says, all of the speakers have stressed the importance of creating shared values for the solidarity economies to work. Can you say more about what strategies you find distinguish the more successful solidarity economy experiments from the type of microcredit / micro enterprise bootstraps model promoted via, say, the World Bank's adoption of the Grameen Bank model? So can you talk about some of the strategies that distinguish the more successful solidarity economic models from some that perhaps may not have been so successful?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Mark?
Sure.
So SEWA, I had, everyone should know who SEWA is. Self-Employment Women's Association. Maybe someone, I'm not good with this chatting business. I get too distracted. But if someone could just do that, put that up there. They're amazing. India, they have millions. They have probably the size of my country as members. SEWA started off as a trade union, but they have all kinds of cooperative institutions a part of what they do. They work with women who are in the informal sector. They're thinking about cooperatives throughout every sector of one's life, right? From shopping to milk to bread to, where you do your banking, housing, all kinds of stuff. And it has been a very pro-feminist type of institution, well, world renowned in terms of, I think, an ideal model of when we think of solidarities, we should be thinking of women of color because they've done so much. Another one that comes to mind for that great question, I like to tell people names that they don't know. The Mata Masu Dubara, which means women on the move. I think it's a Hausa name that comes out of Niger. Not to be confused by Nigeria. Usually in the Sahel, these women have these tontines. There are thousands of women participating in what would be financial cooperatives, but they are self-governed. These are women who people think don't do much in the desert, but they are living very full, successful, rich lives in so many ways. And they're actually instructing, I think, aid agencies who are highly subsidized on how you do locally sustainable economies, right? And because they've been doing that for the longest time. And I think that is what, to me, solidarity is about. It's about being politicized, conscientious about how we do economics. And it's like, I'm sort of tapping into what Jessica said, but doing it on our own terms. And I think that's what one of Sewa's logos are, as like, sort of cooperation on our own terms, right? It's not what men in India are doing in terms of cooperation, but it's what makes sense to women, and particularly vulnerable types of women. And I think at least those are two major ones, but there's so many. I look at, so many different experiments going on within the Black community, but definitely I call them short MMD. So that would be great. Things that are not externally driven, but are financed from within. I think that's key, right?
Yeah, I hesitated initially just because I can't say I'm well versed in the strategies of the failures, so to speak. So I don't know if Carolyn or Jessica would kind of want to weigh in on what they think are failures. I think that would be interesting to hear. But I can talk a little bit about what we try to be attuned to, just in terms of our strategies. And I would just have to say, for me, this just comes up all the time. Definitely relationships are definitely key, and we are very attuned to what we transmit intentionally and unintentionally in our interactions with whoever we encounter. So I would say it's almost an organizing principle for us. The other thing I would say we're really attuned to are just multiple points of entry. And we try to think of, there's traditional organizing, so there's the community meeting, but we also try to think of what are other ways people can come in and access us. So even before the pandemic, for example, we had a Zoom channel, and for us that was thinking of who can't be with us in the space at the day and time. Who can't be with us in the space first, so they could kind of join us on Zoom. And then the other piece is who can't be with us at the day and time. And so then that's where we're doing recordings so that people can access later. I mentioned the event that we had with Jessica, and that was part of our Black Trust series. And that was named very intentionally. So that was tapping into, for us ultimately, this is about trust. So everything that we do is about transmitting, we trust each other. And we trust each other that we have we've conventionally been told that we shouldn't trust each other. And so that's a declaration that we have faith in each other and that we trust each other. And part of that series is then excavating that history. So as has been mentioned throughout this conversation, this isn't new. Jessica talks about the history of Black people and Black women leading this work, and a lot of Black people don't know this history. So that was definitely my experience when first starting out with Ujima and kind of going out and talking to people about this really exciting initiative that was happening. People who've had experiences that you are witnessing, Carolyn, which is when I hear co-ops, I think white people, if I haven't been in one myself. And then if I have been in one, I've experienced racism. So, you know, sounds great, sounds lovely. And this is against the backdrop of you know, what first comes to mind. So that series also served to excavate the history. And of course, Collective Courage was the perfect text to do that with. We also did it lecture style again, because and what I'm really trying to get to is just really providing as many entryways that tap into how people actually live their lives as much as possible. So for me, having grown up as a Black woman in a Black family, in Black schools until I was in junior high and high school, for example, and understanding like a night out is a thing. And, you know, so as I said, there's a community meeting and we like to go out. We like to have a nice night. We like to go to a nice event. We like to have nice gatherings. We like to learn. So I'm also understanding that, and Jessica talked about this, learning and teaching, education is very important in Black communities. And so in putting together that series, those are all the things that we thought about to be able to say, whoever you are, there's something here for you. There's something here that you can grab onto, and it's your door, and then you can then learn about everything else that's happening and take it from there. And I think we are successful with that.
Thank you for answering that question. I think time is running low. I feel like this conversation went by so quickly. I wanted to give Priscilla an opportunity. I know she's had her hand raised. So I wanted, Priscilla, if you're still on this call, if you can ask your question and we'll be able to get it to our panel.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Sorry, I'm just turning this on because I'm routing the internet. It's not so good over here. I speak from Rio, from Brazil. And thank you, Jessica, and also Caroline and Nia for this great conversation. All of your work have been such an inspiration for me. I guess I've been thinking a lot about, you know, the Black community. Like we have a Black women study group here of practitioners of community economies, solidarity economies, community banking here in Rio. And something that we've been, is struggling a lot as even we read some of y'all's work and try to build connections with what we do here and experience here in Brazil. One of the things that we keep talking about is how can we think of Black community economies here when one of the issues that we face as a Afro-Latino community is the very denial of race and blackness. And so that's kind of a general sociological trouble that we always have. And on the other hand, from the standpoint of the solidarity economy framework, we also have had like a most recent tradition of the building up of public policies, backing up solidarity economies during the progressive government that we have had. And that also was led by white Brazilian scholars and activists. So especially now that we are talking about COVID and the responses that Black communities have, its expertise in, and the urgency that we have. At the same time, we're dealing with a state that's very fascist. And so there's the urgency, there's the fear of cooptation of that knowledge from previous progressive experience with solidarity economy driven by white scholars and white policymakers and white activists. So I'm wondering, like, how is it that we might think of maybe transnational coalitions that can kind of not fill in for what the state, what does the hope of progressive state would do, that only ended in cooptation, but can also respond to, you know, the emergency of the time. We have so much knowledge on the ground and such an urgency. And a state that we can not only count on, but we need to fiercely defend ourselves against. And the divide between the institutional experiences y'all have up north and with the history of marronage that we have over here. So yeah, I guess I just also want to kind of share my contact here, because I just see amazing number of people doing so much work. And so I'll be happy to exchange further on.
Thank you so much for that, Priscilla. That's an incredibly important context. So if our speakers want to take a crack at it.
So Priscilla, I'm glad that you brought a global diasporic comment to this conversation, particularly Brazil, right? Such an important part of the African diaspora. Lots of lessons to be learned, for sure. I edited a book which you might find useful, and why I'm recommending it is there were two people writing on the social economy, what we call the Black social economy, and there were two cases from Brazil, and one in particular was useful, might be useful or interesting, is a study Simone Bon and Patricia Grossi write on this, the quilombos of Brazil, and that's sort of inspirational. The whole idea of maroons is something that's also very entrenched in Caribbean society as well, particularly in Jamaica, which was one of my field cases, this idea of hostility to people because of race, even Black people not acknowledging Afrocentrism or their own Blackness, even because sometimes class will supersede that, is very much a contextual reality, but not everywhere in certain locations. And I mean, there's some sort of understanding of why that occurs, right? That will depend on that sort of context. But that's precisely why, at least in the cases where there's that fierce hostility, violence, and extreme forms of inequalities that exist, that people do turn and look for refuge in this sort of what I'm calling the Black social economy. And I saw that very clearly in places of like Guyana, where African Guyanese were being persecuted at the time of my research because of their race, right? In Jamaica, they're in denial about, like, I like the word you use, the denial of being Black. I mean, there are people who might be brownings and lighter colored, and they're just like, well, you know, why are you bringing in this Black question into an issue as an issue? Really, we are just a classed society, right? And so I think that in some ways, looking for this alternative solidarity economy is really important in those contexts of fear and discrimination and racism, right? It even makes it more relevant to have them. So speaking to what Nia and Jessica was saying, it's how do we then amplify the solidarity economy so that it actually is a safe space? And that's what, I think that's in Collective Courage, what I read and took away for the context I use, and I felt was useful, is this idea that people would collectively organize, as Jessica showed you, but sometimes people's businesses would be sabotaged, they could be killed over organizing. These are all really and she's talking in a US context at certain periods, but this is really relevant in other parts of the diaspora, right? And I think that that's a message that's why collectivity is so much part of DNA, right? Like it's a place that you go that's safe. And then we come back to that question of informality. I have that with the banker ladies all the time here in Toronto who don't feel safe, who don't feel like they can speak about what they do because they're going to be accused of terrorism or that they're money laundering or they're drug mules. So they keep what they do, even in a place like Canada, it very hidden in terms of what they do, okay? And I think that the idea of solidarity in informal spaces then becomes very real. Do you see what I mean? Like, you have to perform and engage in cooperative economics in an informal space because that's what makes sense in certain locations. I hope that I'm speaking to that, but thank you for raising that question of, you know, just bringing the diaspora to a larger context of where the anti-Black racism is so fierce that it is danger, right?
That's good. Did you want to respond as well?
Just briefly, I know we're out of time. I do want to thank you, Priscilla, for being on here, for raising those issues. I know times are even worse for you guys in Brazil right now, so my heart, it goes out to you. I really can't say it much better than Carolyn said it. I was just going to say like two more things. In terms of internationally, you made me think maybe we need a whole African diaspora solidarity movement or something. You know, I was thinking about the old non-allied movement, but that was actually more of countries that didn't want to be allied with the North, the global North or whatever. But this isn't really country. I think this would be organizations that would ally to help protect each other and to give each other ideas and whatever. And I don't know exactly how we do it, but it seems like maybe we need that now. And the other thing I just was going to say briefly about, you know, the problems of the Black population in Brazil, a place like Brazil, not recognizing their Africanness and their racial solidarity. You know, that's sort of partly, well, I mean, we all have that problem, but I think you guys maybe have it more than we do. And you have the largest Black population off the continent, which I think is why you guys have that problem. It was designed by the colonialists to make sure you didn't feel a solidarity with Africa. So then how do you do that, right? That's where I go back to the Black Panther breakfast programs, right? They not only fed the children breakfast, but they taught African-American history and African history, because that was the other thing they realized. They needed, the children didn't just need nutrients, you know, food nutrients, they needed nutrients for the soul and for their African souls, right? They needed to understand that they were part of a bigger group of people, even though they were, you know, discriminated against and marginalized, and a small group in the United States. They needed to know they were part of a mighty group of people all over the world, and to understand that history. So maybe that's another thing, right? So you're meeting some immediate needs with the breakfast, with the food, but you're also meeting some of those soul, social, political, spiritual needs with an education program. That's all I've got, sorry. I was trying to end on some great, fabulous phrase, and I was like,
Thank you.
Soul, right?
Thank you so much for
we
that.
got to do the soul too, as well as economic justice. We've got to worry about the soul too.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to a lot of what we talk about with the values that underlie this economy. It's not, we can't operate devoid of those values and devoid of the spirit of this work. So just an amazing point. Thank you, Priscilla, for your question and for really having this broad international conversation. I love the idea of an international solidarity network where we can actually support our work, whether in the Brazilian context or the Nigerian context or the American context, because I think this is a moment where now more than ever, we're realizing how crucial it is to advance the work that we're doing. So I want to thank all of you for the questions. I think that's it for the questions for now. However, before I pitch it back over to Renee for final comments, I want to remind everyone that this conversation is being recorded and it will be available online. We post, I think Mike helps us to post these conversations on YouTube. We have the questions and contact information as well. So that should assist us in being able to make sure that we continue to be in contact with each other. I also wanted to draw attention to the Solidarity Chicago page on Facebook, where you can engage in further discussion. I know the time is short today. That's also a place for engagement, for further discussion, and for past videos, and also for future events. So I wanted to just put a little bit of those housekeeping details on before we wrap up, and then just make sure that all of the questions that we had, so we will be able to continue the conversation, and there will be additional seminars. Again, we try to do this about once a month with Solidarity Chicago, just because of the need of this conversation that we're having. So with that, I want to thank all of our speakers. You all are amazing, and then pitch it over to Renee for final comments.
No, I have nothing more to say. I'm like fired up. I want to thank, our speakers again. I think one of the reasons why we thought it was important to frame this conversation this way is in part, if we are really about the business of transforming the economy, right, of moving beyond capitalism, we have to deal with racism, right? Racism and capitalism are compounding systems, and we know that racism is embedded in this. And so not only for the reasons that there have been so many contributions to cooperative development, to the idea of community capital, to solidarity economy by Black communities and societies, and like there's also for the very reason that it often goes erased or dismissed in more mainstream spaces, right? We wanted to center that conversation today. So I cannot thank our speakers enough for leading us and sharing time and wisdom with us. I think Nia had to go to start an Ujima meeting, but thank you again. And thank you so much for participating in the webinar. Again, it'll be posted as soon as the recording is up. You can access it on YouTube. All of that information will be on the Solidarity Chicago Facebook page. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.